All right, welcome everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. I'll invite our panelists to turn their cameras on when they would like. Wonderful. So we still have people trickling in, but we'll get started here. I've started recording the call, so if folks can't join today, you can feel free to send the recording on to them. It will be on our YouTube channel afterwards. So thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you to our speakers for joining us for this really important and timely conversation. I wanted to start by introducing myself. My name is Laura Cameron. I work with the IISD Canada Energy Transitions team as a policy analyst, and I'm based in Winnipeg. I wanted to acknowledge that I'm currently on Treaty 1 territory. It's the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, the Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, as well as the homeland of the Métis Nation. And I'm currently in my home office right on the banks of the Assiniboine River, near where it meets the Red River, which is historically and ongoing a really important meeting place for Indigenous peoples in these territories. And I'm really grateful to be here as a guest, and I definitely recognize that reconciling our relationships to each other and to the land is a critical part of a just transition. There's no just transition without justice for Indigenous peoples, and I think that that's sort of going to be definitely one of the themes that comes up in our conversation today. So before I hand it over to our panelists, I'll just go through a couple additional notes. Please put your questions, if you have questions, into the Q&A box, which you'll find at the bottom of the Zoom screen. If it's not showing up already, you can click on the little 3 dots that say more, and you'll find the Q&A there. We really encourage people to ask questions. We'll have a good amount of time at the end for a Q&A discussion. So I'll help sort of direct those questions to speakers. But if you have a question for a particular panelist, please feel free to say so. And yeah, we'll go through each of our speakers, and then we'll have about 20 minutes for discussion at the end. So to get us started, I know so many of you may have seen the new report out from the UN today, which shows how current global commitments are keeping us on track right now, have us on track for about 2.5 degrees of warming. And we have a lot of work to urgently correct our course in order to get on track to limit warming to 1.5 degrees globally. And we know that climate mitigation efforts will only be successful in serving our communities if those most affected by the changes, be it workers, organized labor, Indigenous communities and governments, and civil society, are involved in mapping transition pathways. And this is a central part of the just transition conversation that we're here for today. And we've seen momentum building for just transition in Canada this fall. Despite delays, the federal government is now moving forward to develop just transition legislation, which is expected to be tabled early next year. So it's a very active conversation right now. And meanwhile, the federal government has also created a series of regional roundtables you may have heard of on energy and resources with a number of provinces that aim to create sort of regional action plans for these sectors. So today we're going to hear from 4 just transition experts on where we're at with just transition policymaking in Canada, and what labor, Indigenous organizations, and civil society are looking for in both the government's approach and also just transition more broadly. So first, I'll introduce Alex Callahan from the Canadian Labour Congress. Alex has worked in campaign communications and policies since 2008 and is currently the National Director of Health, Safety and Environment at the CLC. Welcome, Alex.
Thank you, Laura. It's very nice to be here, and I was looking through the participants list and seeing lots of friendly names, and so I appreciate the time that everybody's taking. So I'm speaking to you from Toronto. It's the traditional home of the Mississaugas, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat, and it is also covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas at the credit. So I've been asked to speak about 2 things as it relates to just transition. So what are the priorities for the CLC and for for Canada's unions. And I will also just acknowledge that I know Ken is going to speak about Unifor's priorities in this, so I don't, like we work closely on these sorts of things, and so I'm speaking on behalf of the CLC here. And then also talk a little bit about some of the advice to government about how they can talk to labor in respect of just transition and abiding by some of the principles that underpin just transition, namely tripartite social dialogue. So let me begin with the priority for just transition, which is decent work. Just transition is about the world of work as it relates to how we meet our climate goals. Economies will change as a result of legislation and as a result of climate change itself. And so as that happens, we need to ask ourselves, what do we do to make sure that workers are not the ones left holding the short end of the stick? Workers holding the short end of the stick means Canada ends up holding the short end of the stick here. And so there's sort of two parts to this. One is what happens to workers who are working in high emitting sectors, and how do we create pathways that ensure that they are moving into good work that is lower emitting and that's ultimately net zero. And also, as we move towards an economy, a low carbon economy, what are the sorts of jobs that are going to be created, and how do we ensure that those are good jobs? And so so there's a couple of things. Good jobs themselves, the principle of decent work is something that the labor movement spent a lot of time thinking about it. And the International Labor Organization actually has some very helpful definitions of decent work. It has to do with income, social protections, social dialogue, rights to employment. And I'd encourage anybody interested to take a look at the ILO decent work agenda. And you'll notice that a lot of the things I'm going to talk about today do have like international contexts to them, because because this is a global issue, and international labor organizations and global union federations and so on and so forth have spent a lot of time thinking about this and grappling with, especially because of the sort of disparities between the global north and the global south, but also because countries have different emissions profiles, and we all need to be doing our part. So perhaps the most important thing here is that Canada is committed to just transition in international agreements. Paris Agreement, most recently the Glasgow Pact. Canada has said that they are going to follow through with the just transition. And so one of the things that is a high priority for the CLC is saying, you need to walk the walk. It's all well and good to go on the international stage and say that you have agreed to these sorts of principles, but you have to come home and you have to be putting meat on the bones here. And so that means talking about what work looks like. It means engaging workers in tripartite social dialogue, and it means ensuring that what our economy looks like is good for workers broadly. And there's a bunch of different ways that happens, and that I think will be part of the legislation that the government's working on. So let me talk a little bit about some of those principles and what that means. As I sort of led off with, this is about the world of work, and workers have a role in making these decisions, need to have a role in making these decisions and being incorporated into the discussions about this, being incorporated into what our economy is going to look like. We have seen countries have made transitions, and when workers are not involved, they have not been as successful as they should be. People need to know what they're going towards. People need to know how they're going to get there. If you say to a worker, you're going to end up working in economy, you're in economy X and you're going to be in economy Y, and there's no route for how to get there. There's no consultation with workers about how you get from point A to point B, or point X to point Y, like sort of how I described it earlier. You're going to have a problem. People are not going to take it seriously. You have to give people a roadmap to get there. And so workers need to be involved. It's as simple as that. There, of course, needs to be consultation with broader civil society, and I think we're going to talk about that. But consultation and social dialogue are slightly different sides of a coin. So let me just talk a little bit about what that does more broadly. So organized workers have, I think, a unique role in what just transition is going to look like, because they can negotiate through their unions, because they can participate in social dialogue through their unions. And when the tide rises, it lifts all ships. like there's lots of stats out there that will point to the fact that higher union density means higher wages more broadly. It means better benefits and social protections more broadly. There's all sorts of benefits that come along with that. Unions have been at the forefront of negotiating greater equity of opportunity into new employment, into training, and those are principles that are baked into ILO guidelines, and that are baked. So, and because they're baked into the ILO guidelines, they're baked into the agreements that Canada has made internationally. And so, I expect that some of the folks who are on this call are going to talk about other elements of how these things might work. I know, and so what I mean by that is how the regional tables are shaping up, how a commission might be shaping up, or what would be an appropriate way to structure a commission, in terms of how we ensure that it has broad representation and delivers that it's based in social consensus and these sorts of principles, which are like obviously essential to, again, reaching our climate targets. If we don't have people coming along in this process, we're ultimately not able to do the things that we know we need to do in order to limit warming. The cliche is there are no jobs on a dead earth, but it's true. We recognize that needs to happen. And so turning back then for a moment to what this means for government engaging labor and abiding in social dialogue, it means including unionized workers, including workers at every stage. And so let me just refresh for a moment. So tripartite refers to the inclusion of governments, employers, and workers. And so governments are governments that we have in Canada. That includes governments at every level. Because we often see the situation where governments make deals with employers to invest in projects, what have you, and we know that if you don't include workers in that project, then you have fracturing of sort of the social cohesion that you need to actually achieve targets going forward, and so I kind of have to return to where I started, which is Canada has agreed to these things, and we are going to hold our feet to the fire to in fact follow through on the sorts of work and the sorts of just transition that they have committed to, and that's what we're going to be looking for in legislation, and it's what we've been pushing the federal government and other elected folks to have included in legislation coming up. And so I look forward to the rest of the discussion, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk to everybody today. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Alex. That is a great place to start us off, I think, with some of the key sort of tenets of just transition internationally and grounding us in the conversation here in Canada. So next I'll introduce Carolyn Gibson. Carolyn works for the Métis National Council as the Natural Resource and Economic Development Advisor, and is passionate about ensuring that natural resource development benefits Indigenous peoples and is done in partnerships that respect rights and advances socioeconomic well-being for communities. In her role with MNC, Carolyn leads engagement and program and policy development with federal counterparts. Over to you, Carolyn.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And good morning, good afternoon, everyone. It's really great to be here. I'm speaking today on behalf of the Métis National Council from Haida Gwaii, which is the traditional and unceded territory of the Haida Nation. And so today I'm going to sort of start about talking about the Métis Nation relationship with the extractive and energy industry, because I think it's really important background and context, and then transition to think about what does the just transition mean for us and what are some of our priorities within it. And so it goes without saying, and we must start by acknowledging that the health of the land and its resources is directly tied to the health and well-being of the Métis Nation and Métis citizens. And the Métis Nation is continuing the revitalization of the relationship between Métis and their lands and resources. And a really powerful shift is occurring as we begin to recognize and advance Métis leadership in resource development and resource economies. And so, over many generations, Métis have found very innovative ways to live in their particular environments, and that's despite diminished access to lands and waters. And this resilience to change that's been built over generations, coupled with a strong entrepreneurial spirit, has really allowed the Métis Nation to begin to increase participation and leadership within the resource sector. However, this is certainly not without a lot of challenges to get to where we are today. And it's really important to note that this journey towards participation in the sector has been laden with discrimination, reduced opportunities and capacity, and low access to capital for participation in the sectors. And so, with this in mind, this background, the Métis Nation and the Métis National Council is very deeply supportive of Canada's efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and the work of industry to achieve their net zero goals and commitments. But for us, it's very important that as we work to achieve our climate and energy goals, we must acknowledge the past when it comes to how Indigenous peoples and Métis have been treated within the energy and extractive industry. And so given this and the longstanding systemic, economic racism that Métis have faced, extra consideration needs to be given to how Métis people and Indigenous people at large will be affected by a transition away from traditional energy sources. The Métis Nation particularly has worked extremely hard to overcome these barriers to have the position they have in the modern resource sector. And so whether that be through employment currently, procurement opportunities, or ownership within current energy projects, it's really important for us that the Government of Canada does not once again move the goalpost and force Indigenous governments and peoples to once again have to work extra hard to overcome systemic barriers. Those supports must be in place to help Indigenous people and particularly for us, the Métis people involved in the sector, move and be supported through this transition. So for the Métis Nation, it's really important to acknowledge that traditional energy projects contribute more than just direct employment. They contribute to Métis economies through a plethora of ways, one of which is, for example, is through procurement opportunities to Métis businesses. So for us, a priority is that a just transition needs to consider and be reflective of the multitude of ways in which the current energy industries advance Métis and Indigenous economies beyond just direct employment. And any work related to the just transition must support, these multitudes of ways that Métis economies and communities are supported by the current industries. And related to that, and very important, is recognizing that Métis youth are the future of the nation, and that women play a central and integral role within our social fabric. So for us, the key priority for the just transition is that as investments are made in labor and training and supports for a new green economy in that transition, that we have targeted programs and supports that are available for youth and women so that they may achieve the skills and training necessary to not only participate within the sector, but grow and advance and gain leadership opportunities within the sector. And this is going to require different and specific funding and programming. A one-size-fits-all approach will certainly not work in instances like this. And related to all of this is sort of stepping back and thinking about a nation-to-nation relationship between the Métis Nation and Canada. And as the Métis Nation advances on its path to self-governance, ensuring strong and sustainable economic streams is very important. However, given the unique jurisdictional considerations for many resource development projects in Canada and our regulatory systems, it's imperative to the Métis National Council that our provincial counterparts are also engaged in the dialogue and exploring tangible ways to ensure that the Métis Nation is included in any provincial efforts that support a just transition. Because we do recognize these jurisdictional differences and the relationships are different nation to nation across Canada. But we do believe that at the forefront of reconciliation with the Métis Nation is the recognition of Métis rights. And unfortunately, there continues to be a significant knowledge gap and awareness about the laws surrounding Métis rights among different levels of government. And we find this results in myths about Métis rights within the public service that is working to deliver a just transition. This knowledge gap can perpetuate inequities in resource allocation to the Métis Nation and hinder reconciliation with governments as they're not set up to accommodate the distinct and unique claims of Métis people. This is why, as with all federal programming, a priority for the Métis Nation is that Canada takes a distinctions-based approach, whether that be, when forming advisory boards, leading engagement, delivering program or funding. A pan-Indigenous approach is not supported due to the distinct differences between Métis, First Nations, and Inuit. And self-determination on a nation-to-nation relationship means that we lead the engagement with citizens of the nation. This is not a job for Canada, but we support Canada, in providing information and feedback based on our engagement with citizens. So advocating and advancing distinctions-based approach underpins everything that the Métis National Council does within Canada, and is something we continue to advocate for as we advance our nation-to-nation relationship. So I'd say, really in closing, a just transition and a transition to a green and digitized economy is very important to the Métis Nation. But it's inherent that if we do this, we must acknowledge the distinct differences in the experiences that Indigenous versus non-Indigenous people will feel, and that the experiences between Métis, First Nation, and Inuit will be very different as we transition to that new green and digitized economy. So I also just want to say that, of course, I've spoken about distinctions-based approach. So as folks learn and continue to learn about, Indigenous peoples' participation in the just transition, that's important to include diverse voices. So, having this conversation with our First Nation and Inuit brothers and sisters as well is very important. So with that, I'd say thank you very much, and I'll pass it back to our hosts.
Thanks so much, Carolyn. You covered a huge amount in that conversation. And yeah, certainly there's many voices that are not part of this conversation here today that need to be definitely part of the conversation on just transition. And I really hear you on the distinction-based approach, and obviously not having like a pan-Indigenous approach in just transition, particularly, given the federal government's position. So now I'll hand it over to Ken Bondi. And again, a reminder to participants who might have joined since we started, there's a Q&A box at the bottom of they should be at the bottom of your window, where you can type in questions to our panelists today, and we'll be able to field them at the end of our call. So Ken is a national representative for Unifor, the largest private sector union in Canada, consisting of more than 315,000 members working in every sector across the Canadian economy. Originally working at a Ford Motor Company engine and casting plants in Windsor, Ontario, he has represented workers in various capacities for 34 years. For the past 18 years, Ken has worked at Unifor National Office in Toronto with the Health, Safety and Environment Department. Over to you, Ken.
Yes, thank you, Laura, and I as well am speaking to you from Toronto, Treaty 13 territory, Mississaugas of the Credit. As was mentioned, with Unifor being the largest private sector union in Canada, we have a keen interest on just transition policy and process and the eventual legislation that we have been asking for. Our union represents workers in 20 sectors across Canada. So there's a uniqueness there of just about everybody that our Unifor members will be impacted in one way or the other through transition, right down to people that work in service industries, if you really wanted to look into it closely. But some of the things that some of the things that may not be happening right now. First of all, there are these regional consultation tables that are happening. It's a bit of a challenge, in my opinion, that these have been put out by the government, and a little bit of a backwards approach of, instead of perhaps asking for that tripartite partnership that we've been talking about here, that Alex referenced, so that we collectively could go into provincial jurisdictions and look for the people that needed to have comment on this, because we, especially in labor, know more than anybody who those workers are, how they're going to be affected, and we need to collect their information and their concerns, as opposed to, unfortunately, in today's world, a very partisan approach to any issue across Canada. And a result of that we're seeing is some lack of participation in provinces based on politics. And that should not be. Politics is one thing, but workers' lives and the protection of our environment is another thing. And we don't see any place for politics to be played in this approach. So it would have been more effective if we were able to coordinate those tables as opposed to what may be happening today. Having said that, the people that are at those tables, it's easy to forget who may be necessary to be there. So from our perspective in Unifor, we represent oil and gas workers that many of them have been moved or transferred from other provinces because of economic conditions collapsing. So some of those people have experiences in a number of different industries as opposed to just the one that they're working in right now, and would have a lot of offering to that situation. In Ontario, of course, the auto industry is a large factor. Those workers are going through transition right now as auto plants are being transformed to produce electric vehicles. And then transportation workers overall, Unifor is a transportation union, and how are those workers and those other transportation sectors being affected? Is there going to be less work? Is there opportunities for more work? So really what has to happen here that has been waning for some time is, what are the proper steps to go through for us to have a good, just transition? And some of the points that we need to hit is obviously those regional tables, because one situation does not fit all. We have a very diverse economy. We have very diverse provinces across Canada that are affected by a number of different things and are affected by the world markets, quite frankly, that they serve. So it's a much bigger picture, and those regional tables are going to have to focus on what is affecting them in their particular areas. So that is important. Obviously, funding is incredibly important, and there's a number of ways that the federal government can fund this, who should be funding this, and we need to look at those, and we need to have gained acceptance on how that's going to be funded. We need to make sure that workers have protection, that they have wage protection as they are transformed from one industry, perhaps a carbon intensive industry, to a less carbon intensive industry, and that they're not going to be left on the unemployment lines, that they are not going to be left on the welfare lines, but they're going to be funded, they're going to be economically protected, and that there's going to be well-funded educational opportunities and retraining for them. There has to be a reporting mechanism that is going to tell us where we are today, what were those recommendations, and where are we going, a roadmap, if you will, because that's going to give these regional tables, that's going to give organized labor and non-organized labor, by the way. We know that not everybody belongs to a union, but workers need support, whether unionized or not, to know where they are at and where they're going. A lot of the anxiety that's being seen today by workers is that they don't know or they don't understand what this transition concept means to them. And so they're fearful that they're going to be negatively impacted economically, and that's going to play out across their communities and right into their living rooms. So it's very important that we have that laid out policy information now rather than later. And then finally, we need what we've been calling for a long time to put all of this together is a Ministry of Transportation with a dedicated minister. We've talked for a long time about legislation, and legislation is certainly needed. That is needed so that it can cut across the political landscapes that we're in today, that it can survive political change regardless of who's elected in the next election, that it will survive and support workers. And we need a driver to ensure that this stays on that road to success. Because if that doesn't happen, we're already far behind. We're far behind where we are supposed to be today. We're far behind where a lot of the reports that have been put out that we've been looking at in other countries that have this legislation, that have taken action. So workers have a lot more questions than they have answers right now. And these webinars and consultations, and hopefully this legislation is going to answer some of those questions. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Ken. I think that was a very powerful message about, the honest perspective of where we're at right now and how much we have to make up for lost time in terms of progress on a just transition versus the promises that we've made as a country. And so finally, I'll turn it over to Vanessa before we turn to questions. Vanessa Corkle is my colleague at the IISD. She is a senior policy advisor on our Canada Energy Transitions team and leads our work on just transition.
Hi, everyone. It's really great to see all of you here, and I just wanted to thank our other panelists for their really useful insights. I'm speaking to you today from Ottawa, unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory. Originally, I'm from Treaty 6, Saskatoon. And today I'm going to be a bit of a policy wonk and talk about what exactly we can achieve with federal just transition legislation. So what the key concepts that my colleagues have talked about can be operationalized and cemented in policy. So we know that Canada must rapidly reduce its emissions and transition our economy out of high carbon industries that are both leave us vulnerable to affordability issues and price volatility, but also are harming our environment. And we have a massive opportunity to reshape our Canadian economy in a way that advances economic, social, and environmental objectives, to put workers first and ensure that communities that have been excluded and sidelined in the current economy have a chance not only to participate in the economy we are building, but to benefit from that economy and to have a say in how it's developed and designed. So right now, federally, we have the Federal Climate Plan, the Emissions Reduction Plan. We also have the Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act, our climate legislation. But our climate plan does not actually lay out a strategy for the future of workers and communities reliant on high carbon industries, and that includes the oil and gas sector. And this lack of a plan leaves workers and communities vulnerable and with an uncertain future and risks depriving them of economic opportunities. So we have had some action by the federal government on just transition that we saw with the coal transition, but we've seen a lot of delays in how we're moving forward with just transition alongside our more ambitious climate goals now. And there's some big challenges and risks associated with that. The first is that we have a much bigger stakes now. The coal transition affected several thousand workers. We are looking at way more industries. We also are facing challenges like increased automation, increased inflation, and we know that there's going to be thousands of new jobs that must be created and will be created in the low carbon economy, but that also some workers will be negatively impacted if we don't step up to the plate. We also have a poor track record in Canada. Many of the recommendations from the Coal Task Force were not funded or implemented. And there's a big risk that Canada is not going to abide by international standards. So we really need to put pressure on government to encourage them to abide by international labor organization standards, things like social dialogue and the tripartite plus approach that Alex talked about. And also to put their money where their mouth is, because just transition strategy and legislation is one thing, but we can't actually achieve anything unless we have the proper funding to ensure that workers and communities have capacity to transition, that we have proactive and flexible funding that can be nationally coordinated, but that local decision-making can occur, and that the funding is flexible and high enough in scale to actually address the big challenges that we have. So there's three components of just transition policy that I wanted to touch on today. The first is legislation, the second is a strategy, and the third is adequate funding. And I'm not going to talk a lot in detail about funding because That's a whole separate discussion, and hopefully we'll have another webinar next year about that. But essentially, we need to ensure that the legislation that we're putting forward as a country would outline the government's role in supporting workers during the transition and establish capacity for government to actually do the policy implementation, and as well as creating accountability for planning, so government planning as nationally, but also regionally and sectorally. The second piece is a strategy, which is providing assurance to workers about what their economic future might look like, and will also help the private sector to plan. And then the funding component is that not only do we need enough money, we also need that money to be conditional. So we need the funding that's provided, whether it's to provinces, municipalities, et cetera, including industry. There's conditions associated with that to make sure that's in line with our climate objectives. The good news is that we don't actually need to reinvent the wheel. We can learn from international best practice and build a tailored and ambitious approach for Canada. Last year, I should say earlier this year in January, IASD released a report co-authored by myself and Stan Bedell about what best practices exist worldwide on just transition legislation and policy. So I'm going to mention a few of these in my presentation, specifically from Scotland, Spain, New Zealand, and Germany. So what we're looking for in the just transition legislation, which we hear will come in early 2023, is both a top-down approach from government and a bottom-up approach. The top-down approach consists of a national just transition strategy that will set out Canada's vision and objectives for the just transition, look at what are the challenges and opportunities from the low carbon transition, and outline measures to address them. It needs to be informed and guided by experts, by a commission or advisory body that make sure that what we're doing in our strategy is in line with what workers and labor and employers and Indigenous communities want to see. The bottom-up approach is that grassroots level planning, what's happening in regional, specific geographic areas, and how we support regional and sectoral just transition plans. So that's something that the legislation can also support. So there's a few different components that what we want to see in the legislation that I wanted to go over. The first is we want that legislation to entrench goals and principles in international just transition guidelines, specifically to follow what Canada has agreed to internationally in terms of International Labour Organization guidelines for just transition, what we signed on to under the Paris Agreement, the Silesia Declaration on Just Transition, and that includes also our responsibilities to Indigenous peoples under UNDRIP. So that approach should be a tripartite plus approach that is grounded in social dialogue with workers and employers and governments, as Alex outlined, but also that we have consultation with broader groups to ensure that marginalized voices are also taken into consideration. A good example is in Scotland. Scotland actually entrenched just transition principles in their climate legislation, and the relevant minister is required to consider those principles when they're developing the national climate plan. The second piece is development of that full strategy I talked about and enabling regional and sectoral planning. So basically, how do we support place-based economic planning? And here also, there's really good examples internationally. Scotland has developed a national just transition planning framework. Spain's climate legislation requires certain ministers to develop every 5 years a national just transition strategy that identifies the regions, sectors, and communities that will be impacted. And it also analyzes what opportunities there might be to create economic activities and employment. Spain also has a provision in their legislation that requires the government to enter into agreements with regional governments based on the National Just Transition Framework. And this is something that we really need to be looking at in Canada too, because we have a vast geography with very different economic and geographic contexts. And we need to be thinking about how government can support those regions through a tailored approach. Third, we need a dedicated government institution with an actual Minister of Just Transition. So this is essentially what Ken was alluding to. We need to have sufficient institutional capacity in government. And because just transition covers many different topics and will inevitably affect many different ministries, we need to have a way to have a whole of government approach. So some examples internationally include Spain's Just Transition Institute. Scotland also has a Minister of Just Transition. In Canada, what we're looking for ideally is a ministry or at least an agency within an existing ministry that can take that whole of government approach and be coordinated, and that we have a minister in charge of the file. Fourth, a properly resourced advisory body or commission that has broad representation that will directly inform the government approach and strategy, and that the government has to report to for accountability. There's really good examples of this internationally. So New Zealand has a climate change commission, Scotland has a just transition commission, Germany had a very effective coal commission that helped with their coal phase out. And in Canada, what we're looking for ultimately is that the commission does not take an approach, or rather government doesn't take an approach where that commission's advice can be considered and then dismissed, right? We need government to stay accountable to what the commission has found as the best way forward. And then, of course, a way to entrench Indigenous rights and reflect the importance of advancing the expression of Indigenous rights and sovereignty that Carolyn mentioned as well, making sure we're not taking a pan-Indigenous approach, but that we have a tailored approach to engaging with Indigenous nations. Canada has a very specific context, but we can look to New Zealand for some inspiration. Their climate legislation requires the minister to develop a strategy to mitigate impacts of climate, specifically on iwi and Maori. And their climate plan also included separate chapters specifically for the Maori transition. And lastly, there's the accountability piece. How do we ensure that government stays accountable on just transition? We do this by linking the legislation to Canada's existing climate legislation, the Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act, and setting planning and reporting requirements that government is forced to report on, and developing monitoring and indicators so we can make sure we're actually making progress on the file. But just to say, so I've spent a lot of time today talking about legislation. This is only one part of a much broader and comprehensive approach that we need government to take on the energy transition. There's other items we don't have time to talk about today, like green industrial policy, strengthening social protection, upholding the polluter pays principle, that are all really important aspects. But I hope that gives you a good overview of the big opportunity we have, but also the big lift we need to make. Thanks.
Thanks, Vanessa, very much for the crash course on just transition legislation. That's super helpful context. So that completes our panelists. I would encourage folks to please put your questions in the chat, or rather in the Q&A box, which can be found at the bottom of the window, and we'll move to those next. But first, I'm going to put myself on the list with a question that is open to any panelists who would like to speak to it. And that is looking at sort of the government. Some of you have touched on it already, but looking at the government's approach to engaging with labor and Indigenous organizations thus far on just transition. What do you see as sort of the biggest risk and biggest opportunity in the way that the government has approached this to date? I don't know, who wants to jump in here first?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I mean, I'll probably cover two questions off here. I see one by an anonymous attendee. So there's no risk. There is absolutely the risk is not consulting with labor and getting this completely wrong, and it will fail. I've said many times, if you're not talking to labor, then you're doing it wrong, and I stand by that. And the advantages are that any government and any legislation has to have the buy-in of the people of this country. So you have to have that consultation process. You have to have that agreement. And I think it's important to mention that all of the panelists that you see here today, that we've been working hard. The question was, do we have to have this done by the next federal election? Obviously and absolutely. And it's important for people to know that we have been engaged. We have been lobbying members of parliament to move this along and to ensure that a tripartite panel discussion is held. And we have, many organizations have wrote a lot of consultation papers, which allows us to dive deeper into the topic and cover off a lot of other things that may not in just one webinar. And finally, it's the coalition that all of us are working together, labor and environment, working together in lockstep to make this happen. A lot of umbrella groups. I'm a director of Blue Green Canada. which brings labor and environment together. All of these people know that this is something that has to be done. It has to be done imminently. And we are working very closely to make sure that we cover all of the actions that need to be covered.
Thanks, Ken. Alex, did you want to jump in?
I did, and I agree with a lot of the points that Ken has made. I also understand that I was a little tough to hear for part of my initial remarks, so I'm going to speak up. So if people can't hear me, you need to tell me. So I think that there is a risk when plans are made without engaging the people who they affect, because they're the ones who are actually going to know how these things play out for them. They're going to know if the pathways make sense. But I also wanted to touch on something that was raised a little earlier, which you talked about risks, and I think I would also sort of add to that perhaps concerns, which is on the regional tables, like it's still not clear who all is going to be involved and how on these tables. We've been told that labor is going to be engaged in these tables. I assume other groups in civil society have been told that they're going to be engaged in these tables, but I think we're all still waiting to find out what that's going to look like. And the regional tables, to our understanding, look like they are going to be very influential in terms of a lot of the sort of nuts and bolts of how the federal government is planning to spend money, to attach strings, and a lot of these things which are essential to the project. If we're going to say the way that you achieve a just transition is by attaching the right strings to federal money, i.e. job guarantees, i.e. commitments to training, i.e. who you want to bring into the workforce and creating spaces for people. And those sound like they're coming, at least in part, from the regional energy, and I can't remember what the other R table is. What are the terms of reference going to be, and who's going to be engaged in them? That to me, getting that wrong, in addition to the sort of the larger questions around legislation, but getting that wrong is going to be highly consequential. And so getting it right would be highly consequential too.
Great. Did you want to come in, Carolyn?
Yeah, I think I'll come at it with a bit of a different angle when we're thinking about engaging in something that we think a lot about is like capacity to capacity. And so, for us, there's a significant risk that if Indigenous governments and communities aren't properly resourced to even start some of this dialogue on just transition, you're going to miss a very critical voice and part of the sector. And, for many Indigenous governments, the expertise may not reside in-house, and it's going to take time to build that up. So, for us, I think that's something that's so critical, is we can't just necessarily always jump right into building plans and strategies. For some, we do need to start at the beginning and build that capacity. And I think also sort of on the note of engagement, we have so many wonderful public servants that we work with, and on an individual basis, they're kind, they're open, they're willing to talk to us about, whatever it is. But it can be challenging when they're in a system that hasn't put bounds yet on sort of what's in scope, what's out of scope. And it can be challenging when Indigenous governments are looked to define what's in scope and what's out of scope, when we just don't have the capacity to do that type of work. So it's this delicate balance of, not wanting to have something totally baked when it comes, but also, there needs to be some ingredients in a bowl somewhere, and all that work, it cannot be put onto sort of Indigenous governments to lead. And yeah, I think just the capacity piece to be able to do this is so important. And I also think timelines are so critical. Indigenous governments are, in a very wonderful way, are asked to engage on so many things, but we cannot do respectful engagement in 4 weeks' time, for example. And that has to be built into all the work that Canada does, is respecting these sorts of timelines.
Thanks, Carolyn. That's really important. I hope we'll return to this conversation, as Vanessa said, on funding, which picks up on the capacity piece. Like, one of the asks that we've put into some of our recent briefs and reports is specifically around, having funding designated, as we've seen in some other jurisdictions, designated for groups such as Indigenous governance and communities participation in the initial sort of design process. So now we'll go to a couple of questions in the Q&A. There's lots of questions here, which is really wonderful. First, we'll go to a question from Josie around what the private sector can do on a just transition. Do any of our panelists have thoughts on that?
I'm happy to pipe in, and then I would love to hear labor folks' perspective. So from my perspective, well, first off, we need to consider that employers are part of that tripartite process, right? So we need to be thinking about just transition dialogues as having employers at the table in a constructive dialogue. And that also means that when government is meeting with employers about just transition topics, they're not leaving workers and unions out of the room either. So one of the things that the private sector can do, at least in industries that are being impacted by transition, is to make sure that their internal policies align with just transition. So there's a great resource if people want to check it out. The World Benchmarking Alliance has actually developed just transition indicators for companies and has ranked certain companies on their progress on just transition. So it's a really nice way to kind of see concrete steps on what companies can be doing on their own. But I think the other thing is that companies need to be providing information in good faith, for example, to unions about affected workers, and also to make sure that there's active opportunities for workers that might be impacted for retraining, providing them with the time off, making sure that they're protecting existing jobs. And there's many other things that the private sector can do, but just to say that they have a very active role in this. And, we talk a lot about government ensuring private sector accountability. Obviously, if we can have companies who see the opportunity that transition presents and proactively support their workers, that would be ideal.
Oh, Ken and I think both unmuted at the same time there.
Yeah,
so,
go ahead.
Yeah, and this is not going to shock anybody, but yeah, engaging in negotiation on these topics is what the private sector can do when they have a unionized workforce. Collective bargaining is the bread and butter of what unions do, and I think expect more and more that issues around just transition are going to be collectively bargained into agreements going forward, and I think that's, yeah, I mean, we know how to negotiate with each other. It's not always simple, but that's what we're expecting. Hand it up to Ken.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. And I mean, it's obviously a large topic, but from a business perspective of things that we've seen in the past, in the oil and gas industry, for instance, is that if private business was more accepting on wanting to make positive environmental change, that would certainly help. But we watched years ago where private business in oil and gas lobbied to remove the requirement to have decommissioning funds because they felt that it was dead money sitting in a bank account and not being used for investment. What happened, quite frankly, is it didn't go back into investment. It went to the members of the boards of those organizations. So we need to have a more willingness by private business to want to change for more protections in the environment. And the second thing is that there has to be more outward thought. We're seeing that transition happening right now, again, in the auto sector. If you would ask people 20 years ago if the auto sector was going to transition out of internal combustion engines, they would have said absolutely not, because they're making money and we're fine, thank you very much. But market conditions changed, and so they had to change to adapt those markets. I think it's important for private business to do some outreach work, to look outward to the next 20, 30 years on what consumers are going to be demanding, and they can start making those changes now. And those changes are going to have a domino effect to position workers in a better space, in a better place to ensure that employment continues to be sustainable.
So as soon as I muted myself, I had one more thing that I realized I wanted to add. And I think that is only that you can take a look at some of the examples that are out there of where companies have engaged in project labor agreements and community benefits agreements that speak to some of the issues that we're talking about. The ILO, for example, in their talks about some of the blanket PLAs that have to do with offshore wind development in the United States, where you have companies that have engaged with building trades to set master agreements that set prevailing wages with their contractors and subs and through their supply chain, that set committees for equity hiring, training, and so on and so forth. And so there are examples out there of where the private sector is engaging in a way that I think are considered good examples of that. And I would encourage you to take a look at the Renewable Energy and Jobs Report through the ILO and the International Renewable Energy Agency.
Great, thanks both of you. Those are really good points on what good examples and what more can be done from the private sector. There's a question from Martin about how we can work with the Métis Nation. I wonder, Carolyn, if you wanted to comment on how other organizations or individuals might be able to support the work that MNC is doing, or might be able to sort of lift up Indigenous asks on just transition more.
Certainly, yeah. And I want to start by, really just appreciating the question, because it means a great deal to us when people want to partner and support the Métis Nation. We really do believe partnerships and relationships are the foundation of all we do. So we're always open to exploring new partnerships and opportunities. And I never want to presuppose what a certain partnership or relationship, can achieve together. So I won't necessarily speak to specifics of priorities. But one thing, I will note, and, I don't want to speak on behalf of other organizations. And I hate to sort of, echo what I was saying before, but, the capacity piece is a really big thing. So I think for organizations looking to work with Indigenous governments or organizations is really thinking about, what role can I play in maybe helping to alleviate some capacity challenges, asking questions, is there expertise I might be able to help offer? And again, always just coming in with open, as we always find, everyone always is just open to what is needed. I think that's, really valuable and really important. So, and I think, I also think there's thinking about the scope at which, the work. So the Métis National Council, so we represent our 4 governing members in BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Ontario. And so, also thinking about, where's the right level to want to support, asking yourself, is my work specific to a specific province? Then maybe there's a different level that you want to engage with. So I think there's a multitude of ways that, you can partner with Indigenous governments. I think I would just, really emphasize the piece of, what are their priorities, and can I help alleviate any capacity challenges they may face with those priorities.
Awesome, thank you. And I know we just have 2 minutes left. I wonder if one of our panelists would like to comment. There's a range of questions sort of asking how people can get involved and what are the next steps in terms of influencing just transition legislation and beyond. Anyone want to come in on that?
I can come in. We have so much opportunity here, and I think one of the great things we've seen in the past a few months, couple years, is increasing collaboration between environmental groups and labor on this file. But I also think that we have a lot of work to do to work better with our Indigenous partners and with organizations that are representing other groups that have been historically left out of these discussions. I would say that if you are directly connected to policy, then you can maybe use that space to elevate some of the asks. And if you're not, then you should contact your MP and make sure that this issue is on their agenda. So I will maybe leave it there, and maybe I'll pass it around to our panelists, because we should probably wrap up. Thanks.
Great. Anyone else want to jump in here before we wrap up?
No, I think, Vanessa, you said it succinctly, is that people that may feel that they're on the outside simply should be approaching any one of the organizations represented on this panel with your ideas and any other concerns that you have. And I think we all do a very good job of collecting that information and trying to act on it.
Perfect. That's a great way to end this conversation. Thank you very much, Ken. Thank you to all of our panelists. And yeah, we will sort of ISD will continue to try to convene future webinars and conversations, and we're all sort of working collectively on this policy area. So definitely keep in touch, keep tabs on what we're doing, and we would love to hear from you. Apologies we didn't get to all of the questions in the chat, but feel free to follow up with us afterwards by email to continue the conversation. Thank you all so much for joining. Have a great rest of your day.